First, I would like to thank Photoville for creating a space for us to have a conversation about trauma, which I think is really important. My name is Nicole Schilit. I am the Journalist Assistance Program Coordinator at the Committee to Protect Journalists. CPJ is a nonprofit organization that defends the rights of journalists and press freedom globally by reporting on press freedom violations and advocating on behalf of journalists. And we also have an emergencies department that promotes a holistic approach to safety. So we believe that journalists need to be thinking about physical, digital, and psychosocial components of safety and security before, during, and after an assignment, not just after something's gone wrong. And the psychosocial component is equally as important as the other two parts. So I am looking forward to discussing that here. And this year, CPJ has also launched a photojournalist initiative because we recognize that there are certain risks that photographers face due to their proximity to having to be close to the event that they're shooting, and also the implications of the fact that cameras are mostly digital now and people are shooting with their phones, and so what that means for data security, as well as the exposure to traumatic imagery while they're shooting, and also while they're editing, as well as for photo editors. So I'm very excited to have this conversation. We have Ali Baskerville, Cengiz, Ashley Gilbertson, and Santiago Leon. And I'm gonna let them introduce themselves in a moment, but I can't imagine kind of a better group of people to speak to this issue, and they all have a huge amount of experience, and a couple of them wear a couple different hats, which they'll discuss. So I'm gonna let you take it away.
Hi, I'm Ali Baskerville. I'm a photographer. I've done a little bit of conflict work, but prior to that I was an army photographer serving in Afghanistan for 6 months, and also prior to that in Iraq. This is only relevant because we're talking about trauma and potentially conflict and how that impacts us and also the people that we photograph. And I also now work as a media safety trainer and do hostile environment training for freelancers as much as possible, and speak quite a lot on the need to get accessible training for freelancers, especially local journalists and local photographers who are exposing themselves to risk on a far greater scale than perhaps us, who are able to move in and out of these different places that we cover. Do you want me to talk about the image? Or yeah. We were asked to pick a photograph that kind of resonated with us, and perhaps our own journey into how we've dealt with our own potential, our own trauma. And I found in the beginning of my career as an army photographer, I was often tasked to document so many different types of things, from working in the military hospital, photographing the operational procedures, as in on the soldiers when they were hit, down to also ramp ceremonies and repatriations, that I've become quite resilient to being exposed to that. But the stuff that really struck me was the more emotional impact work, and this particular image from Gaza was because I'd got really exhausted of following everybody else into where the places where the airstrikes were, and just realised that my own personal filing cabinet of stress was full, and I also didn't really believe in it anymore. So I had to work out what that meant, and so I decided to photograph in the maternity ward, which is at the back of the Al-Shifa hospital, and kind of made a choice to photograph life being brought into this particular situation, and how do human beings deal with this on a daily basis. And I found that more challenging than the more graphic stuff, which sounds a bit strange, but I just got used to it in a way. But it was this particular image and this particular series that made me just come to a grinding halt and spend the last 2 or 3 years working out what to do next, and where to take the work, and at the same time support journalists to get training, and also to think about their own psychological health or their own mental health as well. I think that's enough. I think that's a long introduction. Yeah.
Hi, everybody. I'm Cengiz. I'm a photographer and photo editor. I've been covering the battle against ISIS for the past 2 years, focused on refugees, Syrian refugee crisis in particular, mass displacement across the Middle East, and Kurdish identity, as well as a variety of minorities in the Middle East. And I'm now based here. I served on the board of the Frontline Freelance Register with Alison for the past 3 years, where we were advocating for freelancer rights, as well as safety training. And one of the most important issues we were always trying to push was mental health safety. So I'm glad we're having this panel and having the opportunity to talk about this, even if it's just a short day, a short hour. This image was from Mosul last year. It was like the last few weeks of the fighting in the old city, and I chose this image because these moments were always kind of the more impactful ones for me, that kind of stuck with me. This was an ISIS guy, a suspected ISIS fighter that they caught leaving the city. And after this image, I had to put my camera down, and I wasn't allowed to shoot. And everything after that moment kind of stuck with me really hard. And it wasn't something I was ever expecting. It was like, it was possibly ISIS, is possibly a really terrible person. And I'm also, I care deeply about all the children and women and men I talk to who are victims of the senseless conflicts. But it was strange to feel impacted also by the torture and the beating, and really the horrible things that were happening to ISIS fighters that I wasn't able to take pictures of because of the people I was with. And yeah, so that's why I chose this picture. Yeah, so this guy was beaten up, tied to the front of a Humvee, and then dragged through the streets, and I'm not sure what happened to him after that.
Thanks, man. My name is Ash. I'm a photographer. I've been shooting conflict for the last 20 years. I'm Australian, and I'm not showing a picture because I just got back from Central African Republic 36 hours ago or something. So I didn't know what to choose. I think that the way we work as journalists in these war zones is it's a cumulative type effect. And we're constantly going through this sort of battle of our own in order to normalize ourselves, not normalize what we've seen, but normalize ourselves to re-gauge what our expectations of society are. The more, I think, when I was working in Iraq, like you, for prolonged periods, I would come back and I'd be like, fuck New York, fuck Australia, fuck Europe, all of these places can suck it. This is not how life should be. The people in Iraq should have a different life, they should have a different way. Until I realized, or came to terms with, that what the people in Iraq, what the people in Central African Republic, what the people in Niger, wherever, they wanted what we had, which is the freedom and the ability to not worry about where they're going to get the next meal, to not worry about if the car bomb is going to explode in the market, to not worry about if they're going to be kidnapped. So in this moment, I'm trying to re-gauge that in my mind.
Hi, my name is Santiago Lyon. For 20 years, I was a news photographer working for the wire services, Reuters, and then mainly AP. 10 of those years, from 1989 to 1999, I covered war and conflict all over the world. And I really messed myself up doing that, so I did a hard reset at some point and reinvented myself, and then became the director of photography at the Associated Press, a job I did for almost 15 years, where I was responsible for hundreds of photographers and photo editors around the world. And one of the things that I was very keen to do in that role was to make sure that they had the proper assistance required to help them process their experiences, because when I was going through that stuff, my bosses in the culture at the time didn't really understand or didn't seem to care, and so it was very difficult for people in the field. So part of my work in that other role was to make sure that these things were properly addressed and that the staff and freelancers had access to trauma experts to help them recover and process all of their experiences. For the last year, I've been working at Adobe, where I'm heading up their efforts in the editorial photography licensing space. So that's a totally different scene. Thus far, not traumatic, thankfully. But because of my experience and whatnot, Nicole asked me to come along and step in for Bruce Shapiro, who couldn't be here today.
Thank you. So, I mean, you touched on resources from media organizations for journalists, and I think they've come a long way, and there's still more work to be done. What advice would you give, though, for freelancers who don't have that backing, who are also maybe feel like they don't have the luxury to take a break when they're approaching burnout or exhaustion because they need to work, it's their career, and they need the next assignment? Anyone can.
Well, I think people need to be aware, and they aren't always aware, that mental health is a very precious thing and needs to be looked after in the same way that physical health does. In other words, you need to take care of yourself, and you need to recognize that if you go to violent places and see violent things and have violent things happen to you, it will affect you. You can't jump into a swimming pool without getting wet. You're not going to jump into these stories without it affecting you. Now, different people are different, obviously, and they have different levels of resilience, and you can't compare experiences per se, because everybody's experience is valid to the person who experiences it. But I think to be mindful of the fact that going to cover dangerous stories, or maybe not even dangerous stories, but going to cover stories that are unusual for you as a photographer because they take you into different areas of the world, it's likely going to have an effect. So I think it's a good idea for photographers to inform themselves about, the nature of trauma, the nature of the psychology surrounding trauma, and be ready so that should they have difficulty processing their experiences, they can at the very least, at the very beginning, recognize what's happening to them. Like when I first went to a war zone back in the late 1980s and came out feeling, fragile and messed up, I had no idea what was wrong with me. And it took a lot of study and a lot of talk with people to really come to terms with it. And that's probably a never-ending process. As somebody said to me the other day, you can't kill your demons, you can only tame them. And so learning how to tame your demons, I think, is a skill that comes with time. But initially, I think photographers should be aware that this kind of work often will have an effect on their psyches.
And I think this is a question that many of us have, had with many of our friends and colleagues. I know I've specifically talked to a number of people. I've had people had this conversation with me. Do we need to take a break right now? Do we need to step away? Do we need to take a breath? And the job is to document and to do the best job we can at that. And if we're not mentally sound, then we won't be able to do that job to the perfection that's required. So if you're not taking a break and you're not taking care of yourself and you're saying, oh, I need the money, take into consideration where you're going to go next, what the next year of your life is going to be like, and you want to be mentally sound for that. You want to be prepared for the work you need to do the next year. So take the break. If you're a freelancer struggling, take the time, step away, take a breath, find some friends to talk to, go running, go work out, and reassess where you are in your career and why you're doing the work you're doing. And if you're having that question at all, just step away and take a break.
I think I'd just like to add to that as well about that saying about having all your eggs in one basket, which I know is a bit of a cliche, but I think most of how we survive as freelancers is flexibility, but also having a range of things that we do. And often when we look at conflict photography or the war photography that we might have done, it creates a certain hierarchy, I think, and people aspire to that. But the consequence of that is, obviously, it does have a detrimental effect on your mental health. So it's also making sure that whilst you're passionate about doing that kind of work, is to have a range of things that you might do, whether it's taking time out to write or to do different projects, maybe do stuff in your own backyard. You're still a photographer, so you still have the skill of storytelling. And I think just having that time to do that helps you to reflect as well on where you're at, because that's basically, from my own personal perspective, how I've managed to do that. And also it's given me time to look through the archive and go through the images, because when you're working at such an intense pace, and perhaps some of my colleagues who have been working over a longer time will have these build-up archives, and actually even going through those can actually have an impact on you as well, revisiting things, memories. So checking in with yourself when you do that. So you want your freelance life to be a long, sustained career, not a flash in the pan, do as much as you can and burn yourself out. You need to be sustainable as well. And there are lots of resources available as well. Nicole's mentioned the CPJ as a go-to place as well. There's also the IWMF, the International Women's Media Foundation. If something's happened to you and you need that financial support so you can take the time out, because it's often the money that pushes us to keep going, right? Because someone's got to keep paying the bills. So there are organisations that can give you a bit of support while you take that time out, and to know what they are, put it in your plan. When you're planning your assignment, have a plan for coming out of your assignment early or needing to take some time out, and speak to your editors about it. There's a lot more conversation around this now. It's less stigmatised. So I think that's probably something I would add to that.
And I just would like to add that CPJ's assistance program does direct emergency grants for journalists in distress, and this includes grants to cover trauma counseling, and we work with a network of partners that also provide this kind of support. So you guys touched a little bit on the safety component, and Ali, I was wondering if you could expand on that, because you're also a trainer, and how the implications if you're not responsible for emotionally.
Yeah, there's a hostile environment training is an industry, right? It's part of the security industry. Therefore, it often makes it quite inaccessible to freelancers because it's expensive and it accrues like big fees to go on it. And also, it's only a few days long. It doesn't train you to be a soldier or to be bulletproof or to go into all the war situations that you might think you might go into. What it does is it gives you a little bit of confidence, and confidence is what you need to help with your own emotional resilience. So sometimes you can help to make better decisions as well. But it's only one part of it, right? It's just one part of the puzzle. Doing HEFAT training is really useful and helpful, but it's not the be-all and end-all as well. Alongside of that, you do have to obviously look at your own mental health, and perhaps even check in with a counsellor before you go on what you think is going to be quite a heavy trip. Do like a bit of a mental health check-in. But that bit of safety training, what it does do is it connects you to other freelancers on the course, and sometimes that's how people build their peer support group, the people that they might stay in touch with for the rest of their careers, who might be working in the same place as them, because often we're quite independent and we're quite autonomous and we're normally quite rebellious and we don't like taking advice, but sometimes when we're in the thick of it, it's our colleagues that kind of get us out with it and become our trusted people to talk to when we're having a bit of an issue. So the training has lots of different uses, and again, you can get, I sound like I'm sort of advertising, but you can get funding and support for this. Rory Peck, ACOS, CPJ, IWMF. I think that's it, isn't it? There's a few. DART. Yeah, as well. And myself and Cengiz, when we were on the FFR, that was what our main thing was to try and get people access to the training, even getting you access to the right protective equipment to take away, knowing how to use it. It just mentally helps you feel a bit more confident to be able to do your role, and I think that's part of your mental health as well.
Do you guys feel responsible towards your colleagues now working, if you start to recognize maybe some of the signs that you've experienced yourself? Is this something you think about more when you're in the field or working or introduced to other journalists, and how do you handle that?
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly recognized signs, and I think I've become much more aware over the past few years than I ever was about my mental health and my colleagues' mental health. But I personally built a pretty good peer support group around myself, and we all take care of each other to the best we can. We do check-ins, sometimes weekly calls, and it's super important. I would highly suggest just making good friends, keeping them close, and like Ali was saying, as freelancers, we don't have anybody else to look out for us. We are our own network. We need to keep track of each other and take care of each other. And I'm lucky enough to have done that for myself and have friends that watch out for me. So I'd suggest you doing the same if you're a freelancer out there.
I would say there's a lot more awareness now than there was 20 years ago. 20 years ago, this was an issue that really wasn't talked about very much. Employers were in denial. Practitioners tended to solve their problems at the bar or self-medicate in other ways. And there was a lot of stigma around it. People were scared to admit that they were having difficulty processing their experiences because they thought it would mean the end of their careers. And I think starting in the mid-1990s, the work of the Canadian psychiatrist Dr. Anthony Feinstein was instrumental in quantifying and qualifying the effects of trauma on journalists as a group. Prior to that, there were no clinical studies had been done. There had been plenty done on soldiers and first responders and all of that, but nothing had been done on the relationship between trauma and journalism. And so Dr. Feinstein carried out a seminal study, and that was at about the time that news organizations were starting to do hostile environment courses, and so they began to incorporate some of that work into their courses. And what you started to see was a lot more awareness in media organizations about the issue of trauma and its effect on journalists, whether it's photographers or cameramen or reporters. And I think since then, the industry itself, the security industry itself has grown, and this is a component part of it. But beyond that, I think that people feel a lot more comfortable now talking about these issues. And the stigma, while it hasn't disappeared maybe entirely, it's a lot better than it was. And I think that's of great benefit to people because they can raise these issues and talk about them and channel into support groups either of their peers or when it comes to getting professional help, which is often best done in the mother tongue of the person who requires it. There are networks of trauma experts all over the world, and they're not hard to tap into. And there's a lot of goodwill I've found in the psychologist and psychiatric community to help journalists deal with these things. So I think we're in a much better place, but it's a never-ending issue.
And just a second off that, Dr. Feinstein's research is available online, at least some of the journalist research is, and he's very open to talk to people and to share that research. He's done Skype meetings with our organization, FFR, and he just talked about what he found and really explained all his research and all his numbers, and it was super helpful. And I'd highly suggest reaching out to him directly if you have any questions.
I think you're right. We have come a long way in terms of just the industry of journalism, the field. But where do you think we can still do better? And where are the gaps?
I think we are definitely more accepting and offer more support for people who are clinically diagnosed with conditions such as PTSD. But I think when we talk about depression and anxiety and general mental health and well-being, we perhaps are still avoiding that. I've worked with many freelancers in organisations who are suffering with quite severe depression who are not going to their line manager or talking to their editor because they feel that it's not as severe as PTSD, so therefore it doesn't matter. And I think that's really important. We can't, again, prioritise one over the other. These things can lead to those more chronic conditions like chronic PTSD and obviously acute PTSD. Obviously, I'm not a psychiatrist, so I can't speak from a medical or clinical background, but I think sometimes the signposts or the flags come up earlier than we realise, and I think we shouldn't be made to feel responsible for those, and that actually as a community of freelancers and of photographers and journalists, when we see those in people, it's good to offer a bit of support, or if someone's trying to talk to you about something, to just openly listen, because again, I think people feel guilty if they don't have something that's more serious, or it's come as a result of something that isn't seen as in a conflict zone. It might be something that's happened to them at home. It might be a really stressful divorce or a personal situation. And if you carry that with you when you go and do the work, it only exacerbates it. It doesn't make it easier. It doesn't get rid of it. And I find that with a lot of my military colleagues, that most of their mental health has happened after they've left, years after they've left. They've been triggered by an incident, something that's happened. So, yeah, I think that's maybe something more of the nuanced stuff that we can perhaps focus on as well, or an awareness anyway.
I think the other area that isn't often talked about is the effect of imagery on photo editors, or video editors for that matter, who are increasingly asked to look at imagery that comes to them on social media or from organizations involved in violence. So you see all the videos that, for example, ISIS put out in recent years of executions and all of that type of thing. It's really upsetting to have to look at that stuff and have to do it as part of your job. And so when I was at the AP, we did a study with the BBC and with the AP and with Dr. Feinstein to look into that, that sort of, vicarious trauma, I guess, and came up with some recommendations and best practices around that, which essentially were, if you have to do that as part of your job, try not to do it all the time. Try and take a break from it. But even for people who take a break from it, some of these images are horribly upsetting. And the video obviously has the added component of sound, which can be devastating when combined with the images. So I think that's an area that probably requires a little bit more attention going forward.
I would add that there needs to be more training and more resources poured into freelancers around the world, and not just international freelancers, also, of course, local freelancers. And there has been a great deal of momentum, especially from the organizations we've touched on, but there needs to be more. There's not nearly enough has been done, especially as far as having training sessions, making resources available so people can get trainings or take the necessary breaks, and there just needs to be more, a massive increase in the amount of resources that are out there for freelancers.
I want to open it up to questions if anybody has. I see a few. I'm not sure if there's microphones around, but go ahead.
I was just wondering if how what you guys do has, I'm just wondering how what you guys do has impacted your relationships, marriages, parenting, like other aspects, other people in your lives, like what, okay.
Totally. This is a stain, war and conflict. It's not limited to what happens on the battlefield at all. It's something that pervades through everybody who comes in contact with it, whether you're a civilian, whether it's your family, even going on generations. I think it has a bearing on how people see the world, how their kids see the world, how their partners see the world. So I think it's never over. You're dealing with it all the time. You get better at dealing with it. It becomes less invasive, hopefully. It becomes manageable. But the things that you see in the field are quite literally unforgettable, and you'll take those with you for the rest of your life. So I think, at least in my case, it's definitely had an effect on all the things you mentioned. What one hopes to do is become comfortable with it and manage it in a way that is healthy and positive, as opposed to letting it get the better of you.
I think with family specifically, when you are in a vulnerable state after coming back from an assignment or prolonged experience, work in a war zone, your family, be it your wife, your siblings, or your children, they're working inside the space that you feel safe. So if you're going to lash out, you're not going to go after your photo editor or the people that you're, the idiots that you might be photographing who are causing problems. You go after your family very often. I think that you need to be really, really conscious. I mean, we've all done this. I'm sure you don't have to have been to a war zone to have done something dumb, and you're doing it for another reason. But the level at which that happens, I've had to train myself to think very, very clearly about what I'm doing and why, but still it doesn't work. I had an outburst a few days ago on assignment, and it's not cool. But it's about being conscious about everything that you're doing, particularly though with your family, because they're not the ones who are sending you there. We're going there voluntarily, so they shouldn't have to suck it because of that.
Just a slightly different to that, and I can recognise those things that you're talking about, for sure, especially with mine's being parents, really. But I would say that it has, in some ways, by taking the time off from that, it's strengthened and emboldened my close friendships with people. Because a lot of the times, those of us who are single and not, who don't have kids or a partner, often feel more isolated because, we sort of think, well, what's the point of, who we're going back to, etc. But you have to create that network. You have to nurture your friendships like you nurture your relationships. They're going to be some of the most important relationships in your life, because you can easily distance yourself from people, and it's almost wrong to think that they won't understand, so you shut them off. So you can create really big barriers from doing this work, and you want to protect them because you love them, but then you get irritated by something, and then you have an outburst and you think, okay, that's not their fault. So I think protecting your friendships, it's made me realise how important creating your own sort of family is. Because I think a lot of us do. I joined the military because I came from an unhappy family, right, a dysfunctional family, and a lot of us did fall into that trope. So I've learned over the years to build that family now so that I don't make decisions based on wanting to run from something. Does that make sense? And I think a lot of the time that's what I was doing, and the army was that route for me. And whilst I tried to maintain relationships within that, sometimes that would create more conflict because I was in a more kind of a role where I was attached to the infantry, and my partner at the time couldn't deal with the fact that I was doing that either. So that created its own level of conflict. So yeah, it definitely has had an effect, but also been in some ways positive. It's made me reflect very strongly on friendships more.
On the positive note, I found that I've had friends that I didn't talk to since high school or grade school that went into the military, and we lost contact. And because we've had similar experiences in our own ways, they felt safe reaching out to me, and I've been able to build new relationships with them because of the kind of strange shared experiences we've had.
Other questions?
Okay, so I have two questions. My first one is, where can photo editors and DOPs improve in supporting freelancers or their own photographers who are dealing with trauma? And my second question is, thinking back to Chris Hondrus's documentary, where there were younger photojournalists coming into conflict zones and kind of depending on veteran war photojournalists to guide them in some sense. What kind of support system have you witnessed or taken part of to support these younger photojournalists?
I can take the first question. I think it's important, if you're a freelancer or even if you're a staff photographer at an organization, to get a sense of what the organization or what the supervising individual's awareness is about all these things, whether it's delving into the practicalities of, worst case scenarios and insurance and long-term insurance and all of those sorts of things, because some organizations don't even think about that stuff. It's just not on their radar. And I think it's important to help get it on their radar by addressing it proactively. And if you find that the organization or the individual that you're dealing with is non-responsive to this and doesn't want to think about it and isn't going to commit to anything, then I think you have to ask yourself the question, do you really want to work for that individual or that organization? Some organizations are very good, some are somewhere in the middle, and some are absolutely horrible. So I think that's an important thing to factor in when you're considering an assignment. And the sort of methodology that I've always used is that sort of worst case scenario thinking, which is a form of risk assessment, I guess, where you're saying, right, what's the worst thing that can happen to me here? If I get killed, well, that's fine, I'm dead. But what about benefits to my loved ones, all of that? But if I get severely injured, if I get messed up, what is this organization going to do to help me? I'm trying to get a sense of that. But those conversations need to be had carefully and in a measured way and not in an alarmist way, just very matter-of-fact, pragmatic conversations. Because as somebody working, you have the right to know the answers to those questions. And I believe employers have the responsibility to people that they send out to assignment, whether they're staff or freelance, to look after them should something go wrong. Sadly, that's not always the case.
I was going to talk about something else, but I remember I was dealing with one client in regards to being killed or injured. And I was they provided an insurance policy for my trips to a combat zone. And it said, I was going through it with my wife, and it was like 250 grand if you die, 250 grand if you lose a limb. And so I wrote to my editor and said, do I get 250 grand per limb? She wrote back and said, it depends on whether or not that limb impedes on your ability to have cocktails when you end up going to hell. So it's always in a very sensitive, gentle manner. Which leads me to what I wanted to say, and that is, you don't always have the luxury of choosing who you work with, but after many years working a particular city and doing foreign assignments for different editors, you work out who you build a rapport with. And for me, at least, I've been called many things, but I can be a little bit sensitive, let's say. And I work very, very well with editors who will take a few minutes of their day to talk to me about how awful coverage today was or how difficult coverage today was. And there's only a few of those editors that I've worked with in my life. Like there's a couple on my books now that I love working for who have always got time. And I know that they've got busy schedules, whether it's back in New York or back in Germany. But when somebody calls you that you've assigned to be in a difficult place, and like, again, it's voluntarily that we're going to these places, but you've got to make sure that the person that you're assigning continues to be operational, continues to work, and continues to be as balanced as they possibly can. So I've had editors where I've called in and said, dude, today was crazy, it was awful. And they're like, man the fuck up, like go back out and do it again. I don't work for those guys anymore. I wait until they lose their jobs and somebody else is in their desk and I try it again. But that's like finding editors that you have a good rapport with, that you trust, is to me really vital.
Can we talk about the level of violence that some of the journalists deal with on city streets and some of the young photojournalists that have taken on engagement with March for Our Lives? They're seeing children with shrapnel wounds in their faces and they're the same age as themselves or their brothers and sisters. How do those young journos handle those situations and how can they reach out for the support? And how are you as an organisation going the level down for the photo schools or the journalistic schools? Because everybody's a bit starry-eyed at what you guys do. And we still perceive you're invincible when you're not. So how do we make sure that the next generation are equipped?
Well, I think, first of all this advice applies to them as well, totally. It's not exclusive to anyone here. It all relates to whether you're covering the rise of the right wing, right? I say in the UK, we're having more young photographers injured in EDL demonstrations now. And I provide advice and support to them as well, as much as I do for people going to a war zone. And that's the thing, we don't always, maybe that's a perception of what we're saying here, that we're somehow invincible, but the reason we're here is because we're not, and we've all been affected by what we do. So therefore the advice that's here is as easy for them to take, well not easy, but it's totally relates to them as well. And I think there is a responsibility, I think, in a lot of photography training communities, whether it's doing their bachelor's degree or going and doing a photography course, where I feel they should have a safety element applied to it now, whether it's working in riots and protests, working in large crowd conditions, doing basic first aid training, even mental health first aid, because actually they might be the future photographers like these people here, right? So if they get it early on, hopefully it will help to build that resilience if they do decide to go into somewhere where the risk is a little bit higher. But risk is not just something that happens in war, it happens in lots of different ways. If you're covering, a friend of mine covered domestic violence in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, and that was a really high risk situation. She wasn't in any of the kind of what they would call the the areas like the Shankill or the Ardoyne, but she was going to domestic violence shelters where she was being threatened by people. So it's more complex than that, okay? So I think that these younger photographers should get safety training at some level in their education, but also be able to access it. All the resources are as much for them as for anyone else. So it's just maybe signposting them to them, you know, making them feel that they're able to access it.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, and CPJ feels strongly that you don't need to go to a conflict zone to need training. Everyone needs training, every journalist, and ideally they'll get in their education, but a lot of people don't go to journalism school or photography school, but it really is something that's relevant to anyone who's working out there, whether you're covering domestic protests, Syrian, or the refugee crisis, environmental issues, like you never know what's going to come up.
I'm Michael Shaw, reading the pictures, and I'm also a clinical psychologist. I don't usually have the opportunity or the chance to, or the situation where I'm put that hat on when I'm at a festival like this, but it makes me think that it's great that there's more consciousness now, but I think it seems like there's also opportunity for more, I guess what would be called psychological inoculation for certainly younger conflict photographers going into a war zone, and some of that, I guess, training would involve understanding more of the dynamics that they're going to encounter right off the bat, and that can range anything from, you know, developing that empathetic, you know, connection to, you know, people on one side or people in a village, children, to understanding some of the psychology of embedding and understanding that the military, for example, has an agenda in terms of, you know, the imagery and the portrayal of that imagery, to understanding the media is looking for pictures that are maybe portray more spectacle than they do you know, abuse or danger or risk. So some of this stuff is obvious, but I don't think it's a coincidence, I guess, that you guys on the panel, you know, are all extraordinarily experienced at this point. And the couple people have already brought up the thing about young photographers or first-time photographers going out there. I mean, there really still is, and I think this is changing also, but that whole dynamic about war as being about adrenaline and being a rush and being you know, exciting, and it shouldn't have to be like your second time, or your third time, or your fourth time, or seeing somebody blown up in front of you, or, you know, for young photographers to have that kind of pragmatic, you know, understanding and you know, from certainly people who've been there, you know, the trauma happens when you're not prepared, and the degree of trauma comes from that. So to the extent that you know, go into it and understand what you're dealing with, that also mitigates risk.
Yeah.
I would just touch on that. Like, trauma doesn't just happen when you're unprepared. Like, trauma can happen if you're the most prepared. Like, you know everything about what you're photographing, and you're I don't know, you've been to that area 100 times, and you've kind of seen the same thing 100 times. Like, it can still happen. You can't put body armor around your brain or your heart. So I would just, like, second off that. But I mean, one of the reasons why how younger photographers become aware is through talking, through things like this, through leaders in the industry raising this point that we need to be talking about this more. Editors need to be having these conversations with younger photographers more, and we need to be, as photographers, if you're a photographer in this room, you need to be talking to your peers about this. There still isn't enough support out there for people. There's still not enough resources out for people, so we need to take care of each other.
I think the other thing I would add to that is, you know, some of us up here have been doing this for a very long time, and we've seen a real shift in the way journalists are regarded by society and by power brokers around the world. Once upon a time, you would show up at a story and have big TV flags and gaffer tape the letters TV to the side of your car, and you would enjoy a certain respect and a certain perception of neutrality. That's all gone now. Now it's, I would argue, much more hazardous because with the advent of the internet and social media, the people who you're photographing are seeing the results of your work almost instantaneously often, and the power brokers are seeking to control that in a much more aggressive way. And in fact, you can draw sort of a direct correlation between the advent of the digital age and the dangers that journalists face all over the world. And so I think that it's really important for younger generations coming into this profession to be aware of that our reference points, I mean, we've had to adapt them, those of us that are still out there practicing in the field, but our traditional reference points of the journalist as the neutral observer with this certain respect afforded to them, that's all gone now. And so I think that gets into the whole area of how do you work as a photographer, and how much do you value the notion of trust, and how do you build trust with your subjects, and how do you get access to things, and all of the sort of corresponding issues that come with that.
I think also asking why. Why are you choosing to do that particular subject at that particular point of time? And I think it's a hard question to ask, because obviously we're driven to do this, but also sometimes we also have to make space for people who are already doing that work, who are already in that place, who are already making those photos, who do them at a really high level. And I think that's, forgive me going on a bit of a tangent, but that's a bit about this colonial gaze that we talk about more now, that we're somehow entitled to keep going away and doing this, where in actual fact there's people in country already doing it and doing it really well. And how do we support them on the ground? How do we support their psychological well-being as well? And I think since I've stopped doing in places like Palestine, I've had more online conversations with photographers there, signposting them to get their own mental health sorted out, so they're still doing what they need to do really well and still provide to most of the major outlets. So it's just one part of it. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it, but just always ask why and who else is there. Could I take someone with me who's less experienced, who wants to get some experience? Could we talk it through with them? And again, that planning process, the planning side's come up quite a bit. Having a plan is key. It's boring, people don't like doing it, and the word risk assessment makes people fall asleep. But it is actually, it's your plan. When you know your plan, you feel more confident to get to it. And there'll always be nuances, there'll always be risks that happens, there'll be stuff that you haven't planned for, but yeah. Anyway, I'll shut up now, I'm going off on blah, blah, blah.
Anyone else? Yeah.
Oh, thank you. A comment and a question. First, comment, thank you so much for being up there and sharing your story and your whatever journey you went through that brings you to this place. Thank you for being here for so many years, and still now to some extent. PTSD and trauma was only talked about in the context of Vietnam War veterans. It's coming about now more, and people are talking about it more because of brave people like you, but I just wanted to acknowledge you all are veterans of your own kind, and so thank you for being here and sharing your insights and experiences. And the second is a question. Ashley, when you were going through that list for that perspective project, and they were giving you $250K for your life, $250K for limb. What about $250K for losing your mind, right? So it's a question, is mental health, is there a line item when you're going through this risk assessment and insurance policies, if you will, is there a line item for mental health?
It's like the better organizations will provide for mental health treatment when you're back. Like I remember coming back from one assignment, coming back from New Orleans after one of the hurricanes there, and a newspaper wanted to send me to a shrink. I'm like, you fucking idiots, I've done 6 years in Iraq. Like, this is a hurricane. Like, anyway, like, that was pretty weird. But like, that somehow company-wide turned into this thing. Like, everybody who goes to New Orleans has to see a therapist when they get back. But then when I did come back from Iraq, pretty troubled at one point, I told my editor, and at one point I had 3 therapists, which was like classic New York, right? I had a human resources therapist, officer, whatever, at the New York Times. I had Feinstein, who I would like pound vodka with on the telephone because he was in Toronto. So I'd get wasted drunk talking to him. And then I had this guy in New York who I saw yesterday. So I had to draw that down back to 1. But the better organizations will provide it. And they will, good editors, if they have the ability, will definitely provide part of their budget to seek that out. Except, this goes back to the heart of a lot of what we're talking about. It has to be an environment in which it's okay to get messed up by what we see. Like, I think one of the things that we haven't said here, I haven't even talked to you guys, I'm sure you agree. Everybody, when I work downrange in these places, in these really troubled, difficult places, I can almost guarantee that everybody that I'm working with has got some pretty difficult pre-existing situation, whether it's their family, whether it's something else that happened. Like, we all have very, very high tolerances for trauma. So when we do hit the wall, it's pretty out there. So I think our editors get that. They don't always have the budget that they can help, though. But they can help in other ways. Like, I've had editors help out and give me a couple of days at the end of an assignment to sort myself out in whatever country I'm passing through on the way home. Little things like that can be helpful as well. But the more aware of this we are, the more likely, another generation of photographers coming through are going to be okay, are going to have more tools to deal with it.
Is there a question over there before?
I just wanted to follow up on what you were saying about decolonizing the gaze and working with local photographers. Is that then entitles other things that should be thought through by editors, that there are very, very, very talented people in there, but they don't know how their lives could change once they are publishing in mass media, and they could be turned instantly into refugees or exposed to other kinds of trauma. Photo editors, mentors, agencies need to be aware that somebody who lives in a conflict situation and then their status changes is suddenly exposed to a much higher level of risk, and they can't just fly back home to New York and talk to their shrink. So this really needs to be thought about in advance.
And that needs to be part of the prep work and the risk assessment, is really assessing, are you putting either a local journalist or photographer, your fixer, your translator, your driver, is it okay for them to be working with you, to be shooting for that outlet? I think that's hugely important. Anyone else?
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for sitting down and chatting to us about this today as well. One of the things that I think maybe we could gain some practical advice and experience from you on as well is that often when you're in a situation of conflict, it's that space, whether it be desperate poverty or whether it be warfare, that becomes the new normal for that time that you're in that assignment. And to a degree, it's easier to process that, I think, than when you return home. So imagine now you're sitting at the waterfront here, drinking one of those nice cappuccinos in this great building. The disjunctures between where you've come from and where you are now, what are the ways that you use to process that movement from the one space to the other? What are the things that we can do to support you as editors? And what are the practical solutions that you can advise someone to take?
I know you're already good at this. You told me to go on a long run at one point when I sent you a long complaint email. But I think, there's a natural process. It's going to be really, really difficult coming back from some of these places. Like I said, I was in car and I came back yesterday and I was walking with my son on 6th Ave. I saw they were tearing down a restaurant, a restaurant with chairs and sinks and tables and food and all of this shit, and throwing it into the back of a garbage truck. And I'm my son's that's amazing, look. He's 9. I was those sons of bitches. Furious. Then I see a dog with a Louis Vuitton coat. The fact that I'm not in jail for murder right now. you have to know what your red flags are, and you have to know what the mechanisms for learning how to manage this are. Like I used to fall back on, whether it was booze or whatever else I could get my hands on, and think that was like self-medication was a form of treatment. Of course, since I dialed that back significantly, or stopped, I realized that being healthy, trying to sleep, like the best solution for any problem that you have is a good sleep. But the space to be able to do that, like somebody telling you just go and get some sleep. I've had editors tell me that. Running regularly, like being healthy, the challenge that you're facing is being overwhelmed. It's coming to terms with the fact that these two places, New York City and Bungie, are somehow on the same planet. And you've got to find a way that these two spots can exist in your mind. And that's management. That's management of the facts of both places. So how do you better manage things? It's through health, it's through exercise, it's through sleep. It's not through like putting white powder up your nose and getting fucking wasted drunk and shouting at people and getting fights with people on the street. Like it doesn't, I promise you it doesn't work. But I think like there's very practical advice that you can give to people that would work, whether you're a photographer like on the streets of Chicago covering gun violence, or whether you're somebody like on the front in Afghanistan or Syria.
There's 3 areas that I've split them into. You can tell I've got a military mind sometimes. Has to have 3 different areas. There's self-care as one bubble, one sphere that I work within. The other one is resilience. And the other one is my peer support, so my friend circle. So I focus on those 3 things, right? So the self-care thing is what do I personally like to do, whether that's go cycling or swimming, or I box. I love boxing. That's where I get all of my anger out of. And then the other part of that is resilience. So do I need to do more training? Do I need to spend more time with my mentors, with other photographers? Do I need to go and shoot something different somewhere? So that's like building into that resilience, even doing some other training. And the third bit, the peer support, is making sure that I contact friends and see them regularly, even though I really don't want to see them at that particular point, but just to let them know that I'm okay. It might be the first few hours you don't want to see anybody, and you can be an absolute arsehole 24 hours after you've come back from somewhere, right? Thankfully that hasn't happened in a while, but yeah, having them know that you're okay, and also don't invalidate them because they don't care. Your stuff does not matter to everybody. It shouldn't. That's really egocentric, right? You might only hit one person's viewpoint that makes them feel a certain way or makes them act a certain way. That should really be enough, right? Because, those little things can change things. So, yeah, just don't be too precious about your work. It's really important, but it's not enough to kind of feel that everyone should care about it. And that's where when I realised that, it's like, stop getting so angry, really. So, but people can be really shit, can't they? So you just have to find a way to cope with that. So those are the 3 things that I use personally myself.
In addition to those, like running and cycling and sleeping well, getting out in nature, like going camping and reminding myself how beautiful this world is super, super helpful. And turning off the phone whenever you can.
I think we have time maybe for one last question. Anyway.
I just wanted to, I actually just finished hostile environment training for journalists just in the last few days with GJS. And this is something I wish I'd done 10 years ago when I was 20 and stupid and thought I was invincible and was putting myself into situations that I thought I could handle. And, I just wanted to ask you guys if there's any resources or where, any young photographers, because I didn't even know it existed 10 years ago. Are there any particular websites or organizations besides CPJ that people can contact to, get the training, either pay for themselves or through scholarships? And, because it's incredibly important. I feel much more prepared, going forward. And I think everybody should have that resource as well.
Yeah, for sure, and everyone else chip in if I forget any of them. There's ACOS, which is the Culture of Safety Alliance, or Alliance for Culture of Safety. And ACOS will have run 2 or 3 courses a year funded for freelancers. So go to their website, signposted. The Frontline Freelance Register, which is based in the UK but is a global network of freelancers, often advertises HEFAT trainings coming up. The Rory Peck Trust is you can get a bursary with them to also get onto a training course. And they're the 3 that I know about.
Yeah, and
and Pulitzer.
And
If you apply to the Pulitzer for a grant, as part of that grant, they will cover your costs to do HEFAT training, because I run that course for them, which is great. It's in the States. Not because I run it. That sounds really arrogant. It's really great because I run it. No, but the whole system. So they actually then help you work for your risk assessment, your insurance, and everything for your reporting trip as well.
But I'd say like, it's super important to sign up. Like, if you need HEFA training, it's super important to sign up for ACOS's email blast. So they have random trainings that come up. So Vice might have a spot this week in Istanbul, or Reuters has a spot in Bangkok, and ACOS has developed a system where if there's a spot open, they'll blast out to the people that are there who have signed up previously and they know your location, so you can get on that course in like a day or 2 notice.
And you can request to them as well. If there's a bunch of you that want it, you can request for training too.
What's with you guys saying we're not invincible? A bunch of you have said that.
Thank you so much. I really can't thank you enough. I think the reason that we're making progress with trauma being a stigma is with having professionals, esteemed, respected, incredible photojournalists like yourselves speaking up about this. So, thank you.